you can return, then we would expect you to do
that. But how long does that stay in place? I mean, for example, could a refugee be here for a decade on a temporary protection visa, set up a life, have kids here, and then find themselves going back to the homeland where they can probably barely remember the language and certainly their children wouldn't be able to speak it?
Well, if conditions in your homeland improve and you no longer need the protection of the Australian government, then I think it is reasonable for us to expect that you will return home. And of course, that is a very important part of the deterrence that we have to make sure that people aren't coming down here illegally in the first place. So, I mean, you've mentioned 10 years. The point is, if conditions in your homeland change, then you no longer require the protection of the Australian government. And I think it is reasonable that after that time you return home.
To what extent is the opposition concerned that a lot of the asylum seekers coming to this country by boat aren't in fact refugees? I mean, the actual approval rates at the moment are quite low.
Well, the approval rates are low in the first instance, but of course once they're overturned, once they go to appeal, the rate still remains incredibly high. We're concerned when 4 out of 5 people who arrive on Christmas Island destroy their documentation, not just Christmas Island, who arrive here illegally, destroy their documentation. Then for us that rings alarm bells. And of course if you do that, once we get into government, we will presume against you being a refugee. Now if you come down here and you aren't prepared to share with the Australian authorities who you are, where you've come from, the circumstances in which you've come, then I think that sends a very strong signal that you are not a genuine refugee, and we will presume against you under those circumstances. Look, we need to have a compassionate but a hard-headed approach to some of these issues. If you were processed by the Australian authorities in the past, your chance of being assessed as a refugee was significantly more than if you were processed by international authorities. And clearly the fact that we've seen people coming from the same countries having vastly different approval rates shows you that this isn't an exact science.
I can just take you to, excuse me, the AFP for a second. There's a clear instance now in one prosecution of whistleblower Alan Kessing, where it appears that the AFP may have suppressed relevant evidence, not supplied it to the defence. What would you do about that if you were in office?
Well, I think if there's any questions asked about the integrity of the AFP, then it's appropriate that they're referred to the agency that's responsible for ensuring that integrity, and that is the Australian Commission on Law Enforcement Integrity. If there was a question mark raised if I was the Minister about any of the actions of the AFP, then I wouldn't have any hesitation in referring that particular
Are you surprised that that hasn't happened, given that there's this question mark over the integrity of this prosecution?
Well, I think it's in everyone's interest to clear the air. If I were the Minister, I would certainly refer that matter to ACLI. And I think that's in the interest of the AFP because, of course, if they haven't done anything wrong, they have nothing to fear from the independent agency having a look at that. And that would seem to me to be a sensible way to go on the Kessing matter.
Mr Keenan, you're a former Shadow Industrial Relations Minister. We're going to have the head of the ACTU on later in the program. How open are you to embracing, as part of, I guess, the Shadow front bench, how open are you to embracing a return to industrial relations reform? I mean, there's evidence that the Fair Work Act hasn't perhaps worked as well in parts as people may have thought it might. Certainly in your home state of Western Australia, there's strong interest and support for industrial relations reforms. Now, the opposition was pretty skittish about this, certainly during your time as Shadow IR Minister and in the lead up to the last election, fearful of a work choices style campaign by the unions. How open are you personally to the idea of re-embracing industrial relations reform?
Well, I'm usually very happy to leave these matters to Erica Betts, actually. But, I mean, clearly the government is having a review of the Fair Work Act, and they seem to have been pushed into having that review, even though they promised that they would review that the new system after 2 years of operation. And we'll be watching very closely for what comes out of that review. And clearly we need to reframe our policy in the lead up to the next election.
Because people like Andrew Robb, Jamie Briggs, the backbencher, Joe Hockey, in fact, they've all talked about a passion or an interest in re-embracing industrial relations reform. Would you put yourself in the same category?
Well, look, I would like to see what comes out of the review. I mean, we're starting to get some evidence about how the new system works. We need to continue to talk to business and to workers about the experience that they're having on the ground, and we will need to frame our policy within that context as we move forward towards the next election.
To what extent do you think that the work choices scare is still alive? To what extent do you think that the coalition has got to be careful at the next election at another campaign based on work choices?
Well, I actually think it's relatively sad now when you see the Prime Minister, with all the problems she has in her office, sort of reverting back to this work choices style scare, when clearly that was an issue that was resolved at the 2007 election. It's 2011 now. The next election will presumably be in 2013. If they want to fight that election on work choices, then they can go right ahead, but we'll be talking about their failings as a government.
They still clearly think that it's an issue, though. I mean, if they're willing to keep going there so long after the event from the 2007 election, they must think that their focus group research, for example, which John Faulkner's not a huge fan of, must be showing something there. And I guess when that's put in the context of some members of the opposition talking about the need to go back to a discussion, at least, about IR reform, the two things coming together could be politically damaging for your side of politics.
Well, I think in the Prime Minister's office there's this big box with work choices in it and in emergency break glass, and when you see Julia Gillard under pressure, she often reverts back to the work choices scare. That is an issue that is really dead and buried, and I think that's a really good example of how out of touch this government is, that they revert back to that when they're under extreme pressure on so many other fronts.
But what about the ACTU? The ACTU did grave damage to the Howard government of 2007. The unions are still very focused on this issue. To what extent do you think the unions could do damage to the coalition at the next election?
Well, it depends how we frame our industrial relations policies, of course, but I mean, I think that there's no point in revisiting 2007. I mean, that battle is well and truly dead. We admitted that we made a mistake in the lead up to then, but this is going back to a long time ago now, and there's clearly other issues that we need to prosecute, such as border protection, such as the carbon tax, all the failings of this government. So I don't believe the next election is going to be fought on industrial relations, and I suspect the union movement will be playing a secondary role under those circumstances.
Before we let you go, I'd like to just get back momentarily to your portfolio area of shadow justice. Tony Abbott has used rhetoric like armada, an invasion of boats. Now, Scott Morrison, sitting exactly where you are when he came on this program, refused to emulate that rhetoric. He didn't condemn it, but he refused to emulate it. What about you? Are you comfortable with rhetoric like armada and invasion to describe the number of boats coming to this country?
Well, I mean, I think the rhetorical questions around how we describe it are pretty secondary to the fact that we've got a very serious problem about people coming to Australia in an unauthorised way. I mean, we have had over 230 illegal arrivals since 2008. That is a very significant number, and I'm not really sure about how important it is about the way we describe it. I mean, I think the policy issue is far more significant than that.
All right, one final question, then we'll let you go, Mr. Keenan. I've got to ask you, as a West Australian and as someone who adopted the state for a little while myself, how do you feel about Simon Kadich being dropped from the Australian Test team? It's a bit of an outrage to me. He's one of the highest run scorers in the last couple of years, and yet he's found himself out of the team. What's going on?
Well, you, of course, are a very welcome guest in Western Australia while you're there. I really don't have a strong view about what the Australian cricket selectors do, and I'll really...
You must be outraged. You must be outraged.
I'm really not going to go there. I think I'll leave these cricketing matters up to the Australian selectors, but thank you for asking. All right,
we'll let you go there. We appreciate your time joining us on Australian Agenda. Thank you.
Pleasure to be here.
When we come back, the panel discussion about the week in politics, plus the head of the ACTU, Jeff Lawrence. Back in a moment.